My name is Adriana Clark. I am the Southeast Region Director for the United States Department of Transportation, specifically with the Office of Small Business, which is under the Office of the Secretary of Transportation as an operating administration. I started with the department in 2007, and so that brings me to about just about 13 years in this capacity. So my role entails small business development, providing technical assistance, advice, and procurement assistance to businesses who are certified and seeking to do business with the United States Department of Transportation, whether that's directly or indirect, meaning they're performing on projects at the state and or local level. And those projects that have federal DOT funding. The Southeast regions includes the states of Florida, Alabama, Puerto Rico, and U.S. Virgin Islands. It's ironic that I did not understand that there was this disproportionate number of women in the industry until I was well into my role as, with the Department of Transportation. I came into this really with blinders on, again, from my own orientation, having to know what I knew about transportation and what my vision was in the industry. And oddly, it didn't relate. So it took me some time to really see as I would go out to different events, as I facilitated panels, as I was a panelist, served as co-panelist, all of my counterparts would be males. And I slowly learned that both through, again, just my going about my work, and as I became involved more with the research, and the education across the country, particularly once DOT set up the Women in Transportation Initiative, and I had responsibility to introduce women to the industry, is when I really began to, see that imbalance, if you will, of the role of women in the industry versus that of our male counterparts. And so I kind of went into it blind to the fact that the field was actually dominated by male. So I think that gave me an edge because I didn't have that as a hindrance. So I was able to move forward with the work that I was doing, and I was very interested and excited about a field that it just simply seemed that many people, both male and female, just did not really understand the depths of how transportation impacts our daily lives. And so I had an opportunity to sort of, come out of, come out of the gate with a vision that was not slighted by the underrepresentation of women in the industry. Pardon me. So I believe that was an edge for me because eventually I began to, I believe, make a mark in the industry. So with respect to influencing women and girls in the industry, well, it started actually by design. The department, and through an executive order that established a Women in Transportation Initiative, and then from there, agencies, all federal agencies, were asked to pay more focus to women, both in their hiring practices, in the procurement arena, as well as just their outreach, ensuring that women were receiving equal outreach and touches about transportation, both, again, from an educational perspective as well as procurement. And so the charge of the regional offices was to establish Women in Transportation, really to influence, educate, attract women to the industry. And so with that, we set out several years ago to do just that. So we went into the colleges and the universities, and in some instances, the high school, talking to women, both in large scale groups, with large audience, both, and also with small audience, maybe smaller groups of female students, to talk to them, one, to gain some understanding about what do they think about the industry. And, primarily what we found was that these female students primarily saw transportation as an industry, yes, for males, and it had to do with construction only, and it meant that they would have to wear hard hats and boots and as a profession. And so we started with dispelling some of those misunderstandings, and providing the knowledge and education so that these female students understood to the extent which transportation affects their daily lives. And it had so much more to do with an industry that really provided opportunities. It was a way that assets were being built to move people towards the opportunities, whether those opportunities had to do with how did they get to their dental appointments, their medical appointments, how did they go to school, how did they return home safely. And so we began to introduce daily life concepts to students, and that began to trigger, a greater and deeper understanding that students can relate to. And so we went about for several years just educating students about what transportation is and what transportation is not. And the offering of opportunities were so widespread. So we talked to marketing students, we talked to students who were interested in science disciplines. We talked to students who were interested in business or technology. And we talked to those students about how their interests and how their disciplines would relate to the transportation industry, and how they can make discoveries about, even down to asphalt, studying asphalt and how that relates to transportation as a whole. Because before any asset is built or designed, or before we bring in engineers, we need to think about, what are the innovations in asphalt? How is asphalt being, mixed? What are its uses? And so we would start at some really basic levels and bring students up to, how an asset eventually, becomes what it is. So whether that's an airport, whether that's a transit system, a railroad system, having to do with maritime, whatever that mode is that moves people and goods, we began a concerted effort in terms of just education to students. I really would like to see transportation thought about in different ways. So as opposed to just roads, highways, bridges, trains, planes, cars, I would like to see, and I alluded to, I would like to see transportation thought of in ways how it impacts our daily lives, how food gets to our table. What does it take along that supply chain for that meal to actually, be before us, for dinner, breakfast, lunch, whatever it is. What inputs has gone into that. So I would like to be able to influence a generation, particularly of women, girls, females, in or outside of the industry, to choose transportation careers because it impacts their lives, it impacts their communities, how their communities are built, whether there's parks in their community, whether, I would like to see students, think about, whether their communities have sufficient number of libraries, who was the planner, that designed that community, And if they, maybe have some concerns or maybe disagree with how their communities look and what assets are in their community, then consider a career in transportation, because they can have an effect on how that community is designed and what assets goes into that community. So whether they're libraries, whether they're roads, whether they're highways going through certain communities, and all those things that we, maybe, talk about around the dinner table that affects us and, causes conversations about what our likes and our dislikes of where we live, where we work, where we worship, and all those, where we attend school, all of those things are affected by ultimately transportation planners, urban planners, city planners that design communities. And I'd like to see those things thought about in different ways, so that, again, ultimately, people are getting to the opportunities. Opportunity, equity, and accessibility would be the three. Opportunity, again, I've talked a great deal about the opportunity, because transportation, if you have transportation or you don't have transportation, you may not be able to you potentially can't get to the opportunity. And whatever those opportunities are. Accessibility, because no matter what socioeconomic, no matter what race, nationality, religion, ability an individual have, transportation should meet that need. Maybe very similar to accessibility. Equity, meaning that every community, every individual have the very same access to transportation that eventually leads to the opportunity. Equity in that, equity in a way that, in my mind, I've seen and own in my own communities where transportation assets has divided a community. So whether that's a highway built, a wall built in a community, that a railroads, the tracks of a railroad is built, and it divides communities. And it leads to inequities in communities, because some have access and some do not have access. And I'd like to see those walls, those highways, those bridges metaphorically torn down, so that everyone has the same access. And that, to me, is equity. My own personal legacy is to, and yes, you're correct, it kind of leads back to, because my emphasis is on those three actually that you just had me to narrow down. My personal legacy is to leave an industry better than it was when I came into the industry, no matter what those number of years amount to, and to influence a generation of individuals around, to influence a generation of people around the issues of transportation and how it ultimately decides whether, a person can, again, experience those opportunities, and those equities that everyone should be able to enjoy.